Good evening. My name is Steve Lewis. I'm a research fellow here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'm also director of our Transnational China Project, also at the Baker Institute, and also director of our Asian Studies program here at Rice. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute for this talk. And up front, I would like to thank you all for coming, and also to thank some of our co-hosts who were able to make this talk possible. There are so many groups and individuals who are excited about Dr. Kleinman's visit that we have quite a long list, including the Transnational China Project here at the Baker Institute, and also our program in health economics under Dr. Vivian Ho. And then also we have the Asian Studies Workshop by the Center for the Study of Cultures, the Asian Studies Program, and then also the Department of History in the Division of Humanities here at Rice University. I would also like to say a few words of introduction about Arthur Kleinman. Dr. Kleinman is, first of all, is a distinguished scholar. He has worked for more than 30 years as a medical anthropologist, both in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard and in the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is currently the chair of the Department of Anthropology. And from 1991 to 2000, he served as chair of Harvard's Department of Social Medicine. Dr. Kleinman is also a very active teacher. He has had more than 50 PhD students, including, I believe, several from Rice University. And he currently teaches courses on medicine and religion, social suffering, new ethnographies of social experience, and a course called What is a Disease? We've asked Dr. Kleinman to come this evening to talk about his research on medicine and culture. He began his research path in the 1960s, studying leprosy, tuberculosis, and stigma in Taiwan. And there he was a NIH research fellow attached to the National Taiwan University Hospital. He followed this with studies of traditional Chinese medicine and biomedicine in Taiwan, and from this published his first book, Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture. From there, he went to the People's Republic of China to study neurasthenia, pain, and depression. And from this research, he produced his book, The Social Origins of Distress and Disease, Neurasthenia, Depression, and Pain in Modern China, which is the first systematic study of survivors of China's Cultural Revolution. Since that time, he has conducted many studies in other areas of China, including studies of epilepsy amongst poor peasants in Ningxia and Shanxi in northwestern China, about the elderly and hospice care in Shanghai, and depression in Guangzhou, and suicide among rural and urban women, and I believe more recently in Beijing as well. From this rich experience in Chinese societies, he's received many awards and honors, too numerous to list here, and he's also been asked to serve as an advisor to many organizations, and I'll just point out a few of them. He currently serves as an advisor to several health organizations and NGOs, including the Beijing Municipal Government's Bureau of Health, the World Health Organization, and China's Ministry of Health. He is also attached to the Harvard Yenjing Institute and is on the steering committee for the new Institute for Global Health at Harvard. Professionally, he's been elected to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies in 1983 and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1993. He has also received the American Anthropological Association's highest award, the Franz Boas Prize. Dr. Kleinman is also one of the principal leaders of what I would say is a Chinese studies organization based in Boston. That would be his family. He is married to Joan Kleinman, who is a China studies scholar at Harvard, and I believe his daughter has a PhD in Chinese politics. And your son is also working in soil science studies, and I guess all of them have spent many years living in Chinese societies, and all speak good standard Guoyu. And so this evening, however, we've asked him to come talk about his most recent research, which is on personal experience, morality and ethics, and physicians and healers, and some of these are based on studies in Chinese societies. His talk is entitled Crisis in Moral Experience, Life in Times of Danger and Uncertainty, and as you may know from the book signing up front, you can see a more comprehensive discussion of this research in the book, just out from Oxford University Press, entitled What Really Matters? Living a Moral Life Amidst Uncertainty and Danger. And I'll also point out that if you didn't get a chance to purchase a book here up front, the bookstore has obliged and will be keeping copies as well. And I urge you to read it, having read parts of it myself. It's just out. After the talk, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, and we're going to put some microphones in the aisles. And so we'd like to ask you that if you have a question, please come up and talk into the microphone, because even though this space is very nice for speaker to audience, it's very hard for audience members to hear each other. So we'd like to ask you to please step up to the microphones. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Kleinman. Please help me, join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. You heard that I have chaired 2 different departments at a university, which is an unusual thing. And we have a story at Harvard about what it is like to be a chair of a department. We say that chairing a department is like mowing a lawn at a cemetery. You have a lot of people under you, but you can't count on any of them for help. Now, that may have some relevance to what I'm going to talk about tonight. Basically, this book sums up much of my academic career in an attempt to say, so what do you learn from this that really matters about life and living? What really matters, and the book that I'm talking from, tells the stories of ordinary people and what matters most to them in normal and extraordinary times. It's a book about moral experience, and I'm going to say in a minute what moral experience is and why it's an important cross-cultural issue, and how individuals and groups come to grips with very real dangers and uncertainties. Those dangers and uncertainties make life matter, and we've become more aware of them in the last few years. But I would say that one of the characteristics of Chinese society has been its great attention to the central role of danger in everyday life. And also, what I want to talk to you about today and what my book is about is it's about us, people like you and people like me, who in the midst of all this are trying to build a life. So how do we do that? Now, I use the term moral in 2 very different ways, and I think it's very important for me to make this clear. Inasmuch as there are things that really do matter to every one of us, life is always about values. For that reason alone, life is a moral experience. In that first sense, just being alive, negotiating important relations with others, doing work that means something, and living in some particular place where other people are struggling to do exactly the same things and are passionately engaged in those same existential activities, indicate that moral experience is inescapable for all of us. But the word moral here doesn't necessarily mean good in an ethical sense. The moral experience that people share in a local world could be good, far from good, might even be malign. The values that we express and enact can be inhuman at times. Think of a local community that scapegoats or viciously attacks a minority, that supports slavery, child sexual abuse, violence toward women, or other human abuses. Here, in such a community, being part of the moral world could mean complicity in terrible acts, just as ordinary men and women were caught up in perpetrating the Shoah and the Rwandan genocide. Now, normal and shared moral experience of this sort is so troubling precisely because what looks so wrong from the outside or from the victim's perspective may not look that way from the inside, from the perspective of collaborators and perpetrators. That is why, in this first sense of the meaning of moral, what is moral needs to be understood as what's local. And the local needs to be understood as requiring ethical review, scrutiny from the outside and from the inside, from those who are strong enough, as it were, to challenge accepted local value commitments. So I'm going to refer to this aspect of the moral as moral experience. That's what we're surrounded by, And that's what often makes our lives troubled. Now, in a second and different sense, life is moral because we want to live a life in which we, to put it in an American phrasing, we do the right thing. Perhaps not everyone, but I think many of us. Here, moral means that we can imagine a certain way of conducting our lives that seems right. We can feel and act on responsibility for others. And we can respond to trouble and those in trouble in a way that makes us feel we're doing good in the world. We expect that other people in very different locales, even if their meaning systems are different and their socialization practices are radically different, might also find that what we're trying to do makes sense to them, since in fact at the existential level, there's a fair amount of sharing across moral experience. And also we feel ashamed, we feel bad if we act in a way that goes against this core sensibility to do the right thing. Now, those who seek to live a moral life may develop an awareness that the world of moral experience that I mentioned first is wrong. They may respond with criticism, protest, and personal efforts to do the right thing, no matter the odds against them being effective and the likelihood of negative consequences for them. Of course, many will not rock the boat, and their moral life will reflect the problems with moral experience surrounding them. And this is how people come to collaborate publicly with unethical policies in spite of their private reservations, and then later spend much of their life feeling guilty and with a sense of misplaced loyalty, while others stay in denial over the whole course of their life. Of course, there are people, and I don't mean to deny that there are such people, there are people who are simply tone deaf to moral sensibility, who appear to be completely unmoved by feelings for other human beings. Now, I refer to the moral in this second personalized sense as living a moral life. And what I want to show, one of the things I want to show, is that living a moral life is very closely connected to the idea of ethics, where we aspire to values that transcend the local. You might study China, but you want to be able to critique China, just like you want to be able to critique the United States from something that's translocal, that's cross-cultural. And we look for those values that can transcend the local and in some sense guide us, no matter what locale we're in living a life. And so one of the questions I have is, can we learn anything from the stories of people who have tried to live moral lives in very different settings of moral experience? And I'm going to read you the story of a Chinese friend of mine and his experience, which appears in the book. Can we learn anything from that? And amidst the particular kinds of dangers and uncertainties that individuals face, can we learn something about what we face? Is it feasible to try to live a life that runs against the grain of the world of moral experience that surrounds us? And when there's real uncertainty about what to do and when the level of danger is high enough, then what do we do? Now, the first major claim I want to make, and I make this for all societies, is that ordinary experience thrusts people into troubling circumstances and confounding conditions. Just think of some of those troubling circumstances and confounding conditions that we see all the time. Divorce, death of a loved one, injustice and discrimination, dead-end jobs, bad relationships with supervisors, joblessness, bankruptcy, severe accidents, disability, political oppression, artistic failure, alienation from our faith community. And these troubles and troubling circumstances and confounding conditions threaten to undo our thin mastery over things that are the deepest things that matter to us, which in my own research often seem to turn on things like self-esteem, intimate relations, or religious values. Take medicine, for example. For all of the medical breakthroughs of the last 50 years, and they've been enormous, nonetheless, most people are still aware that many health problems are incurable. And most of us will face the pain and limitations of chronic conditions. And even a short list of those chronic conditions feels threatening just to think about them. Diabetes, heart disease, ulcers, breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, melanoma, asthma, osteoarthritis, lupus, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's. Add other common cancers and inflammatory diseases affecting a dozen other body organs, kidney failure, chronic hepatitis, depression, as well as other less common disorders for which each of us has a special genetic predisposition, and also serious accidents. And few middle-aged people find it easy to keep their minds focused for long on the odds and the poor outcomes. Not to mention that aging saps our energies, disfigures our bodies, and increasingly slows and muddles our thought processes. I can attest to the last. And death, for every one of us, it's very important to always keep in mind, is a sort of silent haunting of our days waiting for us. Now, we don't usually think about this in American society, but even in our society, financial issues loom large. And in many other societies around the world, they loom tremendously large. Just take this figure. A surprising number of American families, 1 in every 75 this year, goes into bankruptcy. And about 1 in every 25 is on the very verge of financial insecurity. Business problems and career worries come in an equally vast number of varieties, like the proverbial Chinese imperial torture, killing the victim with 1,000 slices. Add in all the many ways that our careers are blocked, personal projects fail, even for the most successful of us, and even or especially close relations go sour, and the argument that over the long journey of living, losses must mount and existential struggles can only be considered unequal seems accurate. Extend the perspective from health and the financial sector more broadly to natural and social disasters. The Asian tsunami reminded us that prediction and prevention have their limits when it comes to natural disasters. Later, Hurricane Katrina and the follow-up hurricane showed that even the world's only superpower could not effectively deal with the immediate aftermath of a cataclysmic storm that displaced hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed whole areas. Now think more broadly around the world. Failed and failing states in Africa, political crisis in the Middle East, and the countless economic and cultural changes that makes people's worlds seem fragile and disorienting would clarify for anyone brave enough to see and say so that ordinary life is routinely overwhelmed by historical transformation and social forces. This is what most people worldwide learn, and this is what most recently, September 11th, the war on terrorism, terrorist bombings in Madrid and London, and the forced evacuation of 500,000 people from New Orleans and 2.5 million from your area taught Americans that social experience is very dangerous. Social life appeared less knowable, if knowable at all, much more uncertain, vulnerable to a degree few had the strength of mind to imagine, not really controllable, and menacing. Now, what I want to say, therefore, on this side is that there's a big lie, as it were, right in the midst of global culture, starting with our own society and going right around the world, because there's virtually no modern society that avoids this lie. And that lie denies the kinds of social problems, the social dangers I've just presented to you. Societies that have a longer tradition, that are older, that have gone through more cataclysmic events, are more aware of this, to be sure. But still, there's something about our modern period and the consumerism associated with it and the like that doesn't do so well, it seems, when we look too closely at social dangers. Now, in the face of those dangers, people struggle, not just with new uncertainties, but steadily throughout their lives, to hold on to and advance those things that matter most to them. Just think of yourself as I try to give you examples from many, many people I've either studied or known. Things like status, jobs, money, family ties, sexual intimacy, sense of order and self-control, health, life itself, but also religious commitments, political arrangements, and all sorts of culturally and personally peculiar agendas. This daily struggle, so regularly camouflaged by humor and irony, can be fierce and desperate because it is inevitably unequal. Now, in my book, What Really Matters, looking at my own field, medicine, I give examples of how this darker yet richly human vision of ordinary moral experience is being made over right now by professionals whose technical expertise often introduces a superficial and soulless model of the person that denies moral significance. Perhaps the most devastating example for human values, in my view, is the process of medicalization, through which ordinary unhappiness, the kind of unhappiness every one of us experiences, and normal bereavement are made over into clinical depression. Existential angst, which, as I've tried to just tell you, is real angst, not just fanciful anxiety. Existential angst is made into anxiety disorders, and the moral consequences of political violence have been recast as post-traumatic stress disorder. All mental illnesses to be regarded as pathological and treated by professional experts, especially with drugs. I want to give you some examples of this because it's very, very important. This is part of what is happening to moral experience in our times. Now, here's a slide from one of my colleagues at Harvard, who's probably the most influential psychiatric epidemiologist in the world today, Ron Kessler. And Ron, in an early study in 1994, claimed that as many as 1/2 of all Americans met criteria for some mental disorder at some time in their lives. This is the wildest form of medicalization, but it's very dangerous because it suggests that the mild forms of uncertainty and unhappiness that we have is somehow pathological, and it takes attention away from the really severe forms of mental illness that require treatment. But look what Ron went on to say, because he's an honest researcher. Given the measurement instruments we have, it's almost impossible to draw a line between ordinary unhappiness and clinical depression. And by doing this, by medicalizing, I believe, the person has been diminished, is being diminished, we're being diminished. The deeply rich diversity of human experience is being thinned out, homogenized, and we're being made over into something new and in a way frightening. Individuals who can channel all our desires into products available for our consumption, but who no longer live with a soul, a deep mixture of often contradictory emotions and values, whose untidy uniqueness has cross-culturally and historically defined the existential core of the individual as a human being. Seen this way, the furnishings of our interior are no longer the same. We are not the same people our grandparents were, and our grandchildren will not be the kind of people we are. So my point is that moral experience is undergoing a transformation in our times, owing in part to the huge changes that are taking place in political economy, politics, and global culture, and in part because we're remaking it professionally into something else. Now, the chapters of What Really Matters set out stories of struggles to master moral experience and live a moral life of men and women like you and me. And these are people I've encountered in my professional career as an anthropologist, psychiatrist, and China scholar, as well as through friendships. Like the rest of us, these individuals have found themselves caught in particular historical circumstances and concrete cultural conditions, where those things that matter most to them have been challenged by what's at stake for society or for others. For example, in the book, a former decorated soldier, now decades into a successful legal career, looks back on the atrocities he committed in the Second World War, the Pacific War, as an indelible mark not only of his own moral failings, but of society's hypocrisy in being unwilling to recognize that what war does is to turn ordinary men into killers. Once the transformation has occurred and violence is unleashed, society turns its back on the moral life of the soldier. The central tension between the person's ethical aspirations and society's moral reality extended for this very angry middle-aged man into a conflict with his psychiatrist, that was me, about what depression and its treatment were about. Is tragedy a disease requiring an antidepressant medication? Is a lifetime secret of having committed a terrible abuse a medical or a moral problem? Are there moral disorders and moral therapies? Are remorse, regret, and repentance not just symptom relief, the appropriate healing outcome for facing up to moral failure? In another one of the chapters, a liberal Protestant minister who's barely able to control his own sexual impulses experiences the selling of sex in the media and on the streets as an existential threat to moral responsibility, his own and his adolescent parishioners. The fundamental conflict between religious aspiration and sexual reality, society's and his own, is experienced first by him as the conversion of guilt into excruciating bodily pain, and afterward as the transfiguration of that pain into the holy. His story explores living a life in the uncharted territory between religion and medicine. In another story, we learn how AIDS, the experience of AIDS, transforms a mother and artist from a taker into a giver, and thereby see how existential crises created by health catastrophe can create a new moral life. And still in another of the book's cases, we learn how a formerly quiet intellectual, this is W.H.R. Rivers in the early part of the 20th century, moved out of the library and into the public world of others' pain and suffering, so as to undo the very moral conditions that made him successful, but which he had come to understand also led to the carnage of the First World War. And now I want to focus on a particular one of these stories, which is a story of a Chinese physician and intellectual confronting the political perils of the Cultural Revolution as a direct threat to his ideals, his family, his career, and his own life. The man I will call, this is a pseudonym to protect him and his family, Dr. Yan Zhongshu, is a retired physician who lives in Washington, D.C. His story is salient because it illustrates how history and politics and economics shape our moral lives, and because it also discloses that individuals in the worst of times can still resist doing frightful things to others, even if the scope of that resistance is limited. Dr. Yan was born in Beijing in 1929 into a small but rising merchant family, the youngest of 5 children, including 3 sons. His grandfather and father built up an import-export business with branches in Shanghai, Tianjin, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. From the late 1920s until 1937, while China was under the rule of the nationalists, the Kuomintang, the business thrived. Yan Zhongshu's grandfather first became a financial contributor to the Kuomintang and later a Kuomintang member. Kuomintang-controlled gangs helped the family business to succeed. Dr. Yan observed sadly, "I don't know all that we did for the KMT, but I always suspected it was a lot and much of it illegal." After 1937, when the Japanese occupied Beijing and later still invaded other areas of China, including Shanghai, the Yans began to develop a behind-the-scenes relationship as collaborators. The Japanese authorities told Dr. Yan's grandfather and father that if they worked closely with the occupiers, they would become even wealthier, and threatened to ruin their business if they did not. At the same time, KMT agents secretly visited the Yans and warned them if they continued to collaborate openly with the Japanese, they would be killed. Under mounting pressure from both sides, the entire family slipped away in the cold gloom of an early winter morning in 1940, and led by KMT agents made their way to Chongqing, the damp, hilly, riverine city in the remote vastness of Sichuan in China's southwest, where the KMT had retreated. In 1945, with the surrender of all of Japan's military forces in China, the Yans returned to Beijing, and they remained there after the communist victory in 1949. At first, they were warily optimistic about their prospects to survive and maintain their lifestyle under the new leadership, which reassured businessmen, professionals, and intellectuals it would respect private property and other rights. But they soon heard that the Chinese Communist Party had begun the mass killing of landlords and the Yens themselves began to feel the squeeze on their resources by Chinese Communist Party cadres. It very soon became clear that private property and businesses would be taken over by the state. Therefore, in 1950, under the subterfuge of visiting their Guangzhou subsidiary to handle a business problem, the entire family escaped to Hong Kong. Yan Zhengshu was in medical school at the time in Beijing and decided, against the strongest family protest, to complete his schooling and remain in China. He said, "I rejected my family. I wanted to contribute to the motherland and work with all my might for values that were different than the commercial ones my family worshipped. Values that led my family to collaborate with whatever power was in control, no matter what they thought of it." Dr. Yan told me that he believed communist rule would be good for China because the new government would prioritize responding to the huge economic disparities, extreme poverty, and political chaos that had created so much suffering for the Chinese. But by the mid-1950s, Dr. Yan had second thoughts. He became disenchanted because of the brutality of the communist policy enforcement, which involved mass killings, forced expropriations, increasingly radical collectivization, and the imprisonment of critics and even those supporters who were suspected of not being enthusiastic enough. In response to worsening political oppression, Dr. Yan surreptitiously made his way to Hong Kong, where he only became more unhappy. And here's a quote from him. "I felt the Chinese in Hong Kong were exploited. There was no idealism at all, just a rush for money. I felt very uncomfortable, like I didn't belong. I thought I felt better in China, as difficult as the situation there had become, because at least in China there was a shared sense of undergoing hardship for some greater purpose, to build a nation. Socialism was oppressive, to be sure, but it was for public health, for social reform, for accessible clinical care, all the right things. Capitalism stood for none of this, but rather seemed to thrive on greed, selfishness, and all the other bourgeois evils I'd been taught in medical school to condemn. Here they all were, and my family was in the midst of it, pushing and shoving for money. I know it sounds foolish now, but at the time I regarded them as the essence of all that was old and ruinous in Chinese culture." So once again, Yan Zhengshu returned to China. The year was 1957. The terrible irony is that this young idealistic physician from a wealthy family returned to China at the very moment radical Maoism was intensifying collectivization and the use of terror, like that deployed by Stalin in the Soviet Union 2 decades earlier, to control those perceived as unenthusiastic foot-draggers, critics, dissenters, and outright enemies of the state. In the anti-rightist campaign of 1957, which saw tens of thousands of intellectuals, professionals, and people whose class background made them suspect sent to labor camps or prison, Maoist investigators interrogated Dr. Yan because of his bourgeois background and what they used to call Waiguowunti, the overseas problem, meaning he had family in Hong Kong. He came through the investigation without being branded outright a rightist, which would have meant years of stigma that it would have put his life on hold, constant criticism, and perhaps time in a re-education through labor camp. But still, he was under a pall of suspicion. In spite of the menacing atmosphere of the opening months of the Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards, that is radicalized youths, held public criticism sessions where political targets were beaten or even killed, Yan Zhengshu still believed he could contribute to build public health and health services for China, and thereby serve the people. Dr. Yan told me that to give himself courage, he added up all the positive aspects of his situation, which even then seemed to him a pathetic way of trying to convince himself of his safety. At the top of the list was his professional competence as an infectious disease expert. This is Dr. Yan again speaking, the earlier campaigns against rightists had relaxed for a period in the early 60s. I was able to marry, we had 2 sons, and my wife was pregnant again with our daughter. I was getting ahead in the hospital. It seemed to me things were getting better. What a miscalculation. I simply couldn't face up to how bad things were and how dangerous they were going to become. It was horrible, truly horrible. Worse than I can convey. My wife was the target of a big character poster. She was beaten so badly one of her eyes was seriously injured. The retina had a tear and no one could help her. They kept her in the basement of the hospital in a kind of prison for several months. When she was released, she had lost much of the vision in her eye and had developed a psychiatric condition. She was fearful all the time. Even a noise frightened her. She didn't want to leave our apartment. Then they sent her to a rural area in the Northeast. It took me a month to discover where she was. Meanwhile, I had 3 small kids. I asked my in-laws to take care of my youngest, our daughter. Then with my 2 sons, I went to a remote county in Gansu, in China's far west. I lived with my sons for 6 years in a very difficult place. A rundown county town with limited electricity, insufficient and inedible food in collective canteens. We were always hungry. But what was really bad was that we had to drink brackish water. My hair fell out. I developed a skin disease. My oldest son didn't grow normally, but seemed stunted. He was sick all the time. I was frightened he would die, and then when things got a little better in our living arrangements, I realized there was no schooling. So he learned about fixing tractors. That's about all. He lost his education, as did my second son, who even today seems cognitively slow. Somehow my daughter managed to come through all right in spite of the fact my in-laws, who took care of her, had by then become street cleaners. I thought about suicide, but what good would that be for my children and wife? We were survivors, my family. Somehow I felt I'd get through, but it was terrible. So bad that when I think about the dirt, the awful and meager food, the dirty, sour water, I feel that old despair again, like a numb, empty feeling, a terrible feeling I don't ever want to relive again. Ah, what a time. Meanwhile, my wife's mental condition continued to deteriorate. I couldn't get permission for her to join us in Gansu, or for me or her parents to visit her in the Northeast. I felt so frustrated. I think it was that made my hair begin to fall out and then turn white. In the 4th year of our separation, I received word that she had committed suicide. I never saw the body or got the details. Was it true? Was she murdered? No one could find out. It was all so terribly inhuman. I became very bitter. I could be surly with my sons and with my patients. I was filled with anger and grief. I was hopeless. Well, not exactly. If I had been hopeless, I would have agreed to remarry. A true peasant wife, the leaders of the county hospital told me. Now this is the part that I want to emphasize, and this is the part called Nemesis. Okay. Let me tell you a story, Dr. Yen said. When the Cultural Revolution broke out, I had a close friend in my clinical department. He and I graduated from the same medical school. He was the classmate I felt closest to. He had a very open personality. We had many good times together. He actually introduced me to my wife. I helped him advance in the hospital. He was very ambitious. We spent our free time together. Once when we were drinking together, we swore an oath to be like blood brothers and protect each other and our families. He came from a different background. His parents were ordinary workers. They were poor. So, Shu Wei-ching, another pseudonym, came from a red background, but he also had a political problem. His uncle had been forced by the authorities to become a soldier in the KMT army. Eventually, his uncle became an officer and escaped to Taiwan, where he rose to a high rank. I knew this and other things about my friend, and he knew just about all there was to know about me. We had sworn to keep these secrets, and I trusted him. Then during the Cultural Revolution, there was a big struggle session in the hospital. A lot of the senior doctors were attacked. But after a few weeks, the criticisms began to include more junior staff. Then I became a target. I got criticized. Wei-ching was attacked for being my friend. He was told by the unit's red guards to draw a clear line between us. And after being roughed up and threatened with being sent to some horrible place in the remote mountains, he ended up denouncing me. That was bad enough. But he did more to hurt me. He revealed everything I told him, which got me into such trouble that only the party secretary saved my life by moving me and the boys to Gansu. Otherwise, I was done for. I just couldn't accept what Wei-ching did. Lots of friends were forced to turn on each other, even married couples. You had to make a show of it or you were attacked. But friends usually said the least they had to. 2 of my other friends did just that. They joined the denunciations. But even though they could have worsened the case against me and gotten me into more trouble, they kept quiet about the more dangerous things they knew about me. Wei-ching told everything. He even embellished the truth so that I looked really bad. It was Wei-ching who yelled first that I could never be trusted, but was an enemy of the people, who should be beaten to death. He grabbed a stick and hit me. He really meant to injure me. I fell down bleeding. There were hundreds of people present. The Red Guards urged them on, but most of the work unit members were silent. I think Wei-ching could have killed me if he'd been allowed to continue hitting me. My head was bleeding, my arm was numb. Then two senior doctors, who were still respected, stepped forward at the urging of the party secretary. They took the stick away from him. They pushed me into a storage room. The party secretary locked the door. I was covered in blood. My glasses were broken. I could feel the blood trickle down the back of my neck where the skin was raw from the beating. Wei Ching hit me so hard in the head I had a gash that required stitches. But I felt no pain. My heart was filled with sadness and grief. Later still, anger flooded through me. I hated him for betraying me and nearly killing me, all to protect himself. Years later, when I returned from Gansu, we were again in the same department. In fact, we shared an office. I couldn't look at him or speak to him. I detested him. I blamed Wei Ching for everything that had befallen me, even what happened to my wife, because he had accused her too. I felt a burning in my chest, rising in my throat, just being around him. Under my breath, I cursed him. You bastard, when I get the chance, I'll get back at you. But never so that he or anyone else could hear. I'd learned my lesson by then. Never trust anyone. In 1982, Wei Ching finally came up to me and tried to apologize. He couldn't justify what he had done, of course, but he tried to make it sound ordinary, as if everyone did what he did. You remember, it was just after the time of the literature of scars. All sorts of personal accounts appeared condemning terrible aspects of the Cultural Revolution. After a year or so, the authorities stopped it because the criticism got out of control. But still, a lot of people were trying to come to terms with what had happened. Several friends, for example, told me how sorry they were, how they tried to protect me but couldn't. I didn't believe them completely, but I could understand their situation. Wei Ching was different. He had told everything and almost killed me, and what he said to justify his actions was simply untrue. I said nothing in return. He couldn't look at me when he spoke. He had no face. I turned away from him. About 4 years later, I had the chance I dreamed about to get revenge. The hospital had a connection with a rural commune in a very poor area of Henan. When they could, they provided us with fruits, and we sent them medicine. Under pressure from the government to help rural areas, the leaders of our hospital decided to reopen a clinic in that commune that members of our department had staffed during the Cultural Revolution. They badly needed a full-time clinical director who could make a commitment of several years. It was a terrible position, a kind of exile. It would finish off the research career of whoever went there. It would be a very difficult place to live. No one wanted to go. Everyone looked for an excuse. The party secretary, who at last had been rehabilitated and reinstated after a terrible ordeal like mine, came to see me. He too had been criticized and beaten by Wei Ching. He said to me that now was the time to get back at him. We can kill him, he snarled, by having him sent to that place. He has asthma and will never survive there. When we have the big meeting to choose a head of the clinic, you propose Wei Ching. Everyone will support you. That's all you need to do. I'll take care of the rest and we'll get the bastard for good. Now, Wei Ching was an excellent physician and researcher. His career was really flourishing. He had big ambitions, but was somewhat thwarted by his past. People remembered his actions in the Cultural Revolution. No one trusted him. He had lots of enemies among the senior staff. Otherwise, he already would have been department head. This was what I had waited for, the opportunity to finish him off. The meeting took place at night. The hospital's main auditorium was filled. There was a lot of excitement and anxiety. Everyone was scared of being sent to that remote clinic. The party secretary asked for nominations. He looked directly at me. I felt all my hatred focus on the words that would recommend Wei Ching. I saw him squirm. He knew it was a setup. He knew I was going to get revenge, that the party secretary would make it happen. He couldn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the floor. You could see his body tremble. The party secretary coughed. He looked at me as if to say, "Get on with it. What are you waiting for? Let's get him out of the way." Finally, out of frustration, he called my name. "Comrade Yen has something to say." I looked at Wei Ching. I felt my face flush, my heart pound. I started sweating. Meanwhile, I could slowly recall the terrible day when Wei Ching betrayed me and almost killed me. "Comrade Secretary," I blurted, "it is too much for any of us to stay in that remote commune for years. It would be like going back in time to the worst days of the Cultural Revolution. Comrade Deng Xiaoping says that a cat can be black or white. It doesn't matter so long as it catches mice. Let us not send anyone out there like I was sent to Gansu and you were sent to Xinjiang. No more vengeance, no more name-calling, no more destroying lives and careers. I recommend instead we rotate the position every few months among the staff. I'm ready to go for a month. So should everybody else." I really can't say how I said those words. I can't remember making a decision to say them. They just came out like an explosion. But I wasn't unhappy with what I said, surprised, but not unhappy. No sooner did I finish speaking than dozens of staff members, senior and junior, yelled their support. There was so much agreement that the party secretary could do nothing but agree too. There was an atmosphere of relief. At any rate, that became the policy. I became a small hero, and the opportunity to get back at Wei Ching disappeared like that. Retrospectively, it seems incredible, but I think I've come to understand myself. I could never hurt anyone like Wei Ching hurt me. It must be constitutional. Even during the worst days of the Cultural Revolution, I couldn't bring myself to attack others. I made believe a few times, but my colleagues knew I was only pretending, and many were that way too. The ruthless ones were those sad cases who completely lost control in the mass hysteria and were capable of doing the worst things. Some had great cruelty in their heart, but most were acting out of fear. They felt threatened and fought to survive. That was a fairly sizable group, but still a minority. Most of us just went through the routines. Wei Ching was so very ambitious he forgot about others. What I think is that he became terrified of what might happen to him. Let me skip ahead here because I'm running out of time. We never spoke again about that time, he and Wei Ching. We worked together for years. There was a superficial return to speaking terms. We joked together a few times. We even took a few meals together. But whenever I thought of my poor wife or my sons and me drinking that sickening brackish water, I felt ice in my heart. I could not forgive him. I did not trust him. And so I would not be too friendly, despite all his efforts. That instinct proved right a few years later. From April 1989 to June of that year, during China's democracy spring, demonstrators in the enormous public space of Tiananmen Square demanded greater political freedom for China and openly criticized the government and the party. Over time, the numbers grew from hundreds of students to thousands of Chinese of every class, background, and occupation. Entire work units marched under the banners of democracy and freedom. Universities, factories, newspapers, citizen groups in different areas leading into and out of this central space, before the Forbidden City, beside the mausoleum holding Mao's embalmed body, next to the Great Hall of the People, and only blocks from the gated community where China's current leaders reside, blocked major roads, prevented the police and military units from entering. Smaller demonstrations took place in other Chinese cities. The political order was under assault. Leading government officials met with student leaders of the protests who were unable to restore order or control the situation, which looked to be spinning toward breakdown of the communist dictatorship, as was happening in Russia and Eastern Europe. Dr. Yan initially hesitated to participate in the demonstrations. He remembered back to the 100 Flowers campaign in the late 1950s, when Mao invited criticism of the government and party, but when it became too widespread and serious, Mao instigated a campaign against the critics who had let their ideas be publicly known. Cynics had said that Mao's original intention had been to smoke out his critics and target them for repression. So Dr. Yan was very wary as the democracy movement accelerated into a full-scale assault on communist society. But near the end of May, as virtually the entire staff of his hospital took part in the demonstrations, he joined the Doctors' March, one of whose leaders was his old friend, the party secretary, who was now about to retire. Following the June 4th massacre, a period of repression and recrimination began. An investigation squad of police visited the hospital, interrogated activists, including the party secretary. Somebody had denounced the work unit's leaders as politically incorrect. Months later, it emerged that Xu Weiqing was the informer. Only modest trouble resulted from the investigations, though it did delay the party secretary's retirement. Several years later, the party secretary told Dr. Yan that he had learned from his connections in the police that Xu Weiqing had been an informer since the early days of the Cultural Revolution. He pointed out that had Dr. Yan acted at the right moment, Xu Weiqing would have been exiled and would not have been able to continue to cause trouble. Now, Dr. Yan's, and comes to the end of it, and I'll open it up for questions. Dr. Yan's career began to wind down in the early 1990s when there was tremendous financial pressure on the hospital. The new party secretary and new director of the hospital held a meeting with senior physicians and told them the hospital faced financial ruin unless it could find new ways of generating money. It turned out that Wei Ching, Dr. Yan's nemesis, was engaged in even more ambitious planning for recreating the hospital as an engine of profit making. Over the next several months, Wei Qing, together with Secretary Tan and Director Wu, made public plans to develop the property that belonged to the work unit, but was a few blocks away, into a shopping complex that included restaurants, a hotel, stores, commercial offices. Indeed, they had already made the initial investments and had lined up a Hong Kong developer. The proposed shopping arcade was particularly difficult for Dr. Yen and his circle to accept because it would replace a rehabilitation unit, a nursing home, and a hostel for the families of patients. The implication of these plans for Dr. Yen and his circle was that the future development of the hospital would be toward highly commercial interests that would undermine the hospital's professional values and academic traditions, remaking its ethos in a direction they could not accept. They complained, but to no avail. This time, the administrators and their allies in the city government warned them to mind their own business or suffer the consequences. Years later, Dr. Yen bitterly observed to me, "We capitulated. There was no alternative. All of a sudden, the operative issues were different. We had, in fact, become more or less irrelevant." As the Director Wu pointed out, but Mr. Tan was worse. A coarse, hard former military cadre. He shouted at us. If we got in the way, he would crush us. We could forget about bonuses or improve retirement benefits. He even threatened to take away our housing. He was like a thug. He knew little about patient care and had little interest in research. His background was in management in the military hospital system. For him, our hospital's research tradition, its reputation for strong primary care meant nothing. Only the high-tech sector made business sense to him. We could have been a factory for clothes or a department store as far as he was concerned. According to Dr. Yen, there was general suspicion that the Hong Kong developers had paid off the hospital's leaders. The rumors of corruption deepened when the hotel opened, and it became clear it was not only catering to legitimate guests, but also attracting prostitutes and gamblers. "I don't think they were selling illicit drugs," commented Dr. Yen with raised eyebrows, "but that was all they weren't selling. I felt demoralized, as did others. What could have been worse than watching the hospital's investments foster STDs, and for all I know, HIV/AIDS? That was when I knew I had to get out. I thought I had wasted my career. I became despondent. I even thought of suicide. Oh, not seriously, but I did have the passing idea it would be one way of protesting they would have to take seriously." Now, at this low point, Wei Qing approached Dr. Yen and told him that he had great plans to develop a biotechnology unit that would be both research and commercial. And he wanted Dr. Yen to be the front man for this because he had the best English and also had a very good academic reputation. He said pretty soon China all over would develop such companies, which has actually happened, and it was precisely the moment to form one. What the hospital needed to do was to spin off a private firm, attract a large amount of capital from Hong Kong and Singapore, and hire researchers, especially Chinese who were returned students from the US or could be lured back from the States. They could cater to the problems of wealthy overseas Chinese, Wei Qing enthused, and develop new drugs for problems such as impotence, baldness, infertility, depression, and obesity. They could apply for foreign grants, and maybe global pharmaceutical companies could be joint partners with them. Everything Wei Qing said blackened my heart. I felt as if a large stone sat cold and hard in my stomach, Dr. Yen reported. After taking a few minutes to calm his emotions, Dr. Yen accused Xu Wei Qing of being a scoundrel, ready to do anything and everything to advance his own ambitions. But even as he spoke the words, Dr. Yen knew he was defeated. Wei Qing had everything working in his favor. The time was ripe, the idea was logical and attractive, the administrators were fully behind it. It would change the hospital completely, but who could say it wouldn't succeed? If it did, the economic condition of everyone in the work unit might benefit. I had to face the truth. What he proposed did represent the future. What I stood for represented a past that perhaps could not be revived again. I stopped, not completing my thoughts. I had nothing more to say. Now, just to end, let me just say that as a result of that, Dr. Yen leaves China to join his daughter, who is a researcher in the United States. And that chapter is a reflection on all of that complex moral experience that I just told you about, of which the most interesting point to me is the fact that we are not condemned. We are not cogs in the machine. We don't just have to go along with the way things are. That remarkable moment when Dr. Yen turns against revenge, turns against doing something harmful, was spontaneous, unmeditated, and brilliant in its effects, and speaks to the fact that our moral conditions are not set in stone. So, what do we learn from stories like this one, these highly personal accounts that help us think about and live our own life? Can studying the experience of a few individuals shape our responses to challenges we'll have to face? Because many of the challenges I've reviewed with you seem unmasterable. What's the implication for how we face them? And the answer, I believe, is just that we need to begin by surmounting our own denial and affirming our existential condition. Such crises and limits can't be mastered in the sense of conquered. They are to be understood and responded to as ethical, religious, and aesthetic challenges. And it is at the level of what they mean for living our lives, that we must find a way forward. And what they mean is that the condition of peril and suspense is what makes life serious and significant, what makes life really matter. Thank you. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Step up to the microphone.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful. Can you reflect a bit on the role of forgiveness? It sounds like Dr. Yen really did not forgive, but I wonder what role that plays in all of this, particularly the ongoing anger and angst that many of our patients seem to carry with them.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a superb question. I think forgiveness is a very important part of it, certainly coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition that comes immediately to mind. Forgiveness has a kind of a different place in the Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist traditions. I would commend it, but what I would pull out from what I've learned from a lifetime of doing research in this area would be the following: that there is a dynamic of violence that occurs at the individual level as it does at the level of the nation state, of the community. That dynamic of violence hinges on a sense of threat and fear. That sense of threat and fear makes us feel that those things that really do matter most to us could be lost or taken away. And at that particular moment, we ourselves develop a second-order danger. We become dangerous when we can do anything, it seems, to protect what we hold most dear. And therefore, what I take from Dr. Yen's case was that he broke that cycle. He broke that cycle of acting with violence, either toward others or toward the self, and doing something worse than the original threat itself was. And that in itself is an extraordinarily important thing to think about. And we can think about it at the level of individual action, because all of us lose our way at times and have got to prevent ourselves from striking out. And we can think of it at the level of the nation state. Imagine on September 12th, if the United States had told the world that rather than engage solely in a war on terrorism, we would have a war on terrorism to get at those who had created our national disaster, but we would do something else as well. We would go to the root problems behind terrorism. We would increase our foreign funding to the poorest of societies. We would improve the understanding in the rest of the world of what America is about and what our values are. That might have had a tremendously different effect by 2006 than we see today. So my sense is that what I take away from this case and the others in this story is that intervening and stopping that escalation of going from a first order violence to second order is critical. In our own tradition, in our own Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of forgiveness, I think, is extremely important. But it's not the only way that you could intervene and break that cycle.
Thank you for that very interesting lecture. I have a question about what your personal interest is in the subject. How did it start, and how do you integrate your own personal experiences into the narratives that you recount?
Well, believe it or not, there's actually a personal chapter, but I didn't have the temerity to present it tonight. There is a chapter about myself, and and my attempt to get at what matters most to me and why I'm so engaged with this issue. And I can tell you that there is a deep personal reason for that, but I would prefer not to go into details on that right now. But say this, that I'm 65 years of age, and like a number of the people in the audience here, I've had a lot of professional experiences. I've actually had a golden career, in fact. And it occurred to me that there's a time in which you want to ask the question, well, what have you learned that's really useful about living? I don't know whether at Rice you widely teach Michel de Montaigne's essays, but that was basically what Montaigne, the great French essayist, said. What do we learn from these things that teach us anything about how to live our life, how to build a life? Because that's what we do. We all build our lives in the sense of the German Bildungs. We form, we build, we craft a life. So what do we learn from someone who's a psychiatrist and anthropologist and has done all this cross-cultural research in two radically different societies, Chinese and American? What do we learn that's useful for living? And just the things I told you here, I could also explicate in terms of my own personal life. And I would just suggest buy the book and reread the chapter, and then afterward I'd be happy to speak to you about it. Yes?
Thank you again for this talk and for the remarkable example of Dr. Yang. I'm thinking in terms of health. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the act of forgiveness would be also a way of healing. What do you think is Dr. Yan's way of healing as he comes back to the States, as you say, enjoying his daughter? What was his way of healing, coping within his Chinese, Taoist, Confucianist, or Buddhist tradition?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, the point I'm making is that if we take a narrow view of healing, existential problems can't be healed. That's the existential condition. But that would be an incredibly narrow view of what healing is. If we take a broad view of healing and see that the ethical, religious, aesthetic dimensions of healing are a crucial part of what it is to be human, then we see that that is in fact how we deal with these unmasterable conflicts between moral experience and building a life. That in the setting of recognizing that these problems are not ones we're going to be able to change in a fundamental way, what we can do is begin to think ethically, religiously, and aesthetically about the way that beauty, divinity, and ethical purpose play a role in our lives. And we can do some things in that regard. I would just say to you as a very small and trivial example of this, that the recent experience we had at Harvard where we got rid of a Philistine president who was a brutal, dictatorial man with very little appreciation of anything outside of a very small economistic view of life, is a very, is a small example of a faculty coming to terms with the fact that there were things crucial to it that that they would respond to in such a way as to insist on the importance of core meanings. And those core meanings, not anything else, are what led to the firing of our president at Harvard. And I think that, I would say again, that it's the ethical, it's the aesthetic, it's the religious that are immensely important. And that it's in this setting that we can begin to realize, what do those things do? They are empowered by our weaknesses, but they in turn empower us to find meaning in life. And meaning is crucial to hope. And life without hope is unendurable. So my sense is that this is where the focus should be. Not so much on the sort of what are practical healing strategies so much. I mean, that's wonderful in everyday clinical experience. But the kinds of issues I'm talking about go beyond everyday clinical experience. And I think in that setting, it's the healing of meanings that counts the most. Please, yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in the point you're making that there's an over-medication of a lot of what is considered perhaps natural life stages. And especially as a parent, I'm struck by the number of children in school that are given Ritalin and diagnosed as ADD very quickly. What do you think that implies for the future generations, and how can we correct that?
20% of American kids are on medication, psychoactive medications. And by the way, in international perspective, we don't stand alone. There are other countries that have rates that are right up there with ours. I think it is very troubling. One of my postdoctoral fellows right now from Hong Kong is doing I think a brilliant study of attention deficit disorder, which is now skyrocketing in China. In the Chinese setting of the one-child family, if you don't perform at the highest level in the educational system, parents see attention deficit in two interesting ways. One way is to get their kids Ritalin so they can work harder, and two, if they don't succeed, as an excuse for why they didn't succeed. And so clearly what we have today, we have these core disorders that are real diseases, depression, anxiety disorders, those are real diseases. But around them, we have a huge penumbra of things that are not real diseases. I'll give you the examples from in my own experience. When I began training in psychiatry, so long ago that it's hard to remember, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was in its second edition. And it said that normal bereavement lasted for a year. And after a year, if you had the symptoms of normal bereavement, you could then call someone clinically depressed. Because after all, the symptoms of bereavement and depression are exactly the same. What does the latest edition of the DSM say, the DSM-4 say? It says that normal bereavement lasts for 2 months. Okay? So you don't have to be cross-culturally sophisticated to realize that this is an absurdity, and that only the United States is the only country in the world that has made a statement like this, that normal bereavement for a child, for a parent, for a spouse lasts only for 2 months. And then after that, if you're not over your sadness, your loss of energy, your difficulty concentrating, you've got a pathology, you've got clinical depression, should be on an antidepressant. So that's a problem. And why does that occur? Well, I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy here. I don't believe in conspiracies. But I think there is a elective affinity, as it were, between the pharmaceutical industry, between the epidemiology of making more patients, between the work of clinicians. If you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail in a sense, and the giving of antidepressants. And I think the latest thing I've heard, which is in many ways shows that this problem is going to get worse, is that some psychiatrists now state that maybe normal bereavement should be treated with antidepressants. That is, there's no reason to even have one day of sadness or upset after the death of a loved one. That you don't need to be in pain. It can be taken away from you with the proper medication. I find that very, very distressing and disturbing, but I think we're headed in that regard. So if you know social theory, there's a social theorist I have in mind when I'm thinking of this, and that's the great German sociologist Max Weber, who died in 1922. And shortly before his death, Weber, looking ahead to the long 20th century, predicted that institutions would become the strongest part of society, the most powerful edge of society, because institutions could quantify, generalize, rationalize. And Weber said that institutional structures would come so to dominate society over the course of the 20th century that we would be led into an iron cage of rationality in which we would have to fight to maintain tradition, sentiment, and rule of thumb. That is, spontaneous. And I think in a sense, Weber may have overstated it, but in a sense, I think that's why we are seeing a rekindling in the religious domain in the United States, and in many parts of the world. We're seeing a rekindling in the ethical domain and in the aesthetic domain, a sense that there is an immensely powerful technology-driven, rational, technical kind of thinking that is beginning to replace many of the human things we took for granted. And I think that, that in my view, medicalization is a perfect example of Weber's technical rationality. Please.
Yeah, in some of my own studies of privatization that's going on in China and other societies, I find it really striking to compare China to other societies in this, and in particular to see that there is this type of privatization of even the most important social institutions as hospitals and education, and it seems the degree to which it seems unquestioned within government, within private circles, so-called intellectual circles, to me is just amazing in comparison with other societies. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that, about is there something about this in China's experience, or is it kind of a weakness of the medical profession in standing apart from or not having ties to other strong social, or I think perhaps maybe some of the reasons that the privatization of hospitals in particular has not occurred in some other societies, in say Brazil or some of these other ones, is that maybe they're tied to religious organizations, which give them some other type of social legitimacy. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about China.
Absolutely. Sure, that's a great question also. Just a whole set of wonderful questions for me. Take a look at this overhead, which I use in the book to look at the way that moral experience changes. So the argument I make is that changing political economy, politics, and global culture themselves cause three things that are in close interaction to change. Local cultural representations, that is the core meanings we have. The Chinese setting, as David Apter and Tony Sach in their great book on Maoism showed, one of the results of the Cultural Revolution was literally to turn the Chinese Confucian tradition on its head. And the ultimate result of that was to breed cynicism and a kind of alienation from cultural traditions. And my former student, Yunxiang Yan, in his fine book, Private Lives Under Socialism, shows how this works out in the sense that in the rural area where he does his research, you see the absolute loss of ideas of filial reverence, filiality gone out the window, etc. Social experience is the way we're socialized to be a certain way. and subjectivity is because of who we are inside. These three things change together. So one of the things that we see, for example, that you'll be very sensitive to, and you know as well as I do, is that on the social experience side, the Chinese have always had the guanxi wang, the circle of connections around ego, around the self, as the crucial way in which social capital is mobilized and social careers are built. But there was a part of guanxi wang that was always regarded to be deeply moral, which was the idea of runqing guanxi, that this was a crucial moral relationship. But increasingly, as Yun Chang Yen shows, and have Jing Jun and many others, you're seeing that it's what was a fantastically wonderful moral tradition of interaction becoming a you scratch my back, I scratch your back kind of pragmatism that has sort of removed the very core from it and turned it into a source of corruption in many ways. And then on the subjectivity side, I think you'd have to say that the one-child family has brought online a very different personhood very much attached to shopping. Now, I'm a New Yorker. I'm not against shopping. It's always said of New Yorkers, when the going gets tough, New Yorkers go shopping. But I would say that in Chinese society, the consumerism is simply bewildering. I mean, especially if you were in China, as I was, in the late 70s, and when there was no consumerism, as it were, and to see what's happened is just extraordinary. And then to realize that sense of subjectivity has also changed to lack certain kinds of restraints or constraints. And maybe in a sense, we can say that the Nemesis, that Dr. Yan's Nemesis, Wei Qing, represented in a way a kind of forerunner of that sort of issue. So the big issue today, as I see it, is that having undermined the Confucian tradition, marginalized Buddhism, and made Taoism more or less irrelevant, it seems to me, to many activities in everyday Chinese society today. There are almost no ethical, religious, or aesthetic constraints on this sort of wild capitalism, unbelievably wild capitalism. And I think we see that. And we see that in the medical domain, not so much with hospitals, though they're somewhat interesting. But we see it in the illegal practices in the pharmaceutical industry. So for example, China has a huge problem today with pills that have nothing in them. That there are people making pills and putting sugar in them or something and selling them as an antibiotic or as something else. They have a tremendous problem in that area. And in many other areas in which you see people taking advantage of the cutting edge of sort of marketing without the constraints, without the kinds of constraints that we see in our own society. Though with the Enron trial going on here, maybe I should be careful about what I say in terms of our own society. But it seems to me that there is something in Chinese society that has changed so fundamentally at the level of the subject, of who the person is, how the person considers himself and the like, that is simply astonishing. And I see it very often in my wife, who's a China scholar, had translated one of the great Confucian training manuals, the Chenzi one, the 1,000-character classic, which is like the Shaojing, is filled with these stories of filial piety. But I'm just astonished all the time at the absence of filial reverence when I meet with Chinese colleagues and friends. And you realize that the one-child family has radically restructured what social experience is for the Chinese. And I think you see this right through the economic side of things. So, but having said that, I want to counterbalance it by also saying that I think this is an extraordinary time in Chinese society, and I think to see China, at least coastal China, the 300 million people on the coastal edge of China, achieve wealth is simply, for anyone like yourself or like me who studied Chinese society, is simply fantastic, unbelievable, and has enormously positive sides as well as the negative story that I've been emphasizing tonight. That's the other thing maybe I should say to the group is that I'm not against exuberance, happiness, and love, for example. I think all those things are immensely important. I think they gain their great importance in the face of what I've just laid out to you. It's seeing the existential nature of our lives that actually makes us, I think, able in a deeper, more reflective, more sophisticated way to be happy, to be ebullient, to participate in love. I think that all those things are enriched by facing up to our existential condition. So I could close with that point, that 35 years of a career centered on this issue, on this existential aspects of living, has convinced me that counter to all the statements that if we start looking at this or face up to it, we'll be paralyzed. We won't be able to get out of bed in the morning. Is quite wrong. That we enrich our lives. We have the potential for transformation out of examining existential realities. And it's actually this big lie in modern culture, this lie that wants to say that there are no existential limits, that actually undermines, in my view, happiness and the other things I mentioned. Thank you. Yeah.